All right, so before we get into our context configuration, a couple quick housekeeping items. Went ahead and saved off a copy of the config on ASA1 into Notepad. Also went ahead in our diagram here for our quick context example, showing that we have a separate setup here on the inside interface, the sub-interface connecting to switch 2. So we have that configured and have that VLAN defined. Don't have that configured on ASA1, but we do have the switch 2 side of that configured. Also with that, in this case, being on a different VLAN, in this case going to be VLAN 128, did make sure that VLAN was defined on the switches and did also adjust the earlier configuration on the switch. Earlier we were just allowing VLANs 10 and 125 on that trunk interface. Did change that. So looking at our switch now, for the show interface trunk, which we looked at before, verifying our VLAN information, we did add in that other VLAN, VLAN 128, which is going to be used in this particular setup for the context. So now, as mentioned, our first option for setting up the context, first item to do is changing from mode single to mode multiple. So we're going to go ahead and switch to our ASA, and we're going to make that change. And we did also change the host name slightly here, or change the prompt actually. Doing a step on to what we did earlier, looking at the prompt information. Modify the prompt to also include the state information. In this case, this device not only being primary, but also being the active device. So on the secondary, we show it as secondary and standby. Now we are going to go ahead and remove that configuration for the failover. Turn off failover here. And we're going to go ahead and switch to mode multiple. Again, it does give you a message here. It will change the behavior device, will initiate a reboot. We're going to go ahead and confirm. It does give you an option to convert the system configuration. We're going to go ahead and accept that for now. But changing the system configuration, it will convert instead of just completely erasing it. So it will sort of be saved, setting that to flash, saving the old config to flash in the event that we do need to try and recover part of that. And again, while we're letting that device reload, going to pull back to our firewall configuration examples. Again, listed in the configuration guide on the firewall itself. A variety of different examples. Looking through some of these just to get the basic gist of things. Again, different options, multiple mode firewalls, single mode firewalls, active, standby, different possibilities. Looking through some of these configurations, looking through some of the generic things being done. In this case, having a single interface, individual contexts themselves having a shared outside interface in this case, all the same interface, whereas different inside interfaces for the respective networks, so showing that you can have different items configured there, and getting into the respective configurations for those. So globally having interfaces defined, having your context defined, within your context itself, as mentioned, having a config URL, that's where is the device storing the configuration for that context, Beyond that, having a context name defined. In addition to having a context name defined, we also have interfaces allocated. So I have a context named, interfaces allocated, and the config URL for where we're storing that information in Flash. Now, a couple different examples in this particular configuration example. In this particular example, using a redundant interface, in this case saying allocate interface redundant 1.3, so using both redundant interfaces and a subinterface. Again, if you are doing something like that, again, those would be defined up here. So in your main system area, having the redundant interface defined, member interfaces are, and then if you're doing a subinterface, what VLAN, having the information there. Again, make sure your main interfaces are not shut down. Now, in addition to using a redundant interface and subinterfaces in this particular example, also looking at a second option here. In this case, we have the INT1 and INT2. In this particular case, what this does is from within the context, if you're customer A and you're connecting to your device, you don't see your interfaces available as redundant 1.3 or redundant 2.5. You just see interface 1 and interface 2. You can set up a name alias of what you would like the person to see when they're inside the context looking at the interface. They don't necessarily have to know what interface you're handing off to them. Give them a separate name. In addition, this also one happens to be using other context classes. In this case, having classes to be able to distinguish customers or groups by priority, and with those priority items, giving them resource allocations. So the member gold here, in this case, would correspond to class gold. And within that class, having a rate for connections, what the connection rate can be, as well as what the total connections being allowed is for that individual class. You can have, say, different class of customer you're supporting and have different ones with different thresholds, also so that one context will not overwhelm everyone. So different possibilities there. All right, now our device here has switched over here. He did take his failover information. And taking a look at our configuration itself, in this case, is fairly sparse compared to what we have. In this case, it took our existing information and put that into an admin context. So again, we're going to just go ahead and change our prompt back here. We're just going to switch back to hostname context. Now in this case, I am in multiple context mode. I can look at that, show mode, show me as multiple context mode. I'm still in routed mode, show firewall. Will show that I'm in firewall mode as a router, not as transparent mode. I have my mode, I have my setup here. If I want to look at that information, it did create this admin context for me. You need to have an admin context. So we're going to go ahead and change to that one. Change to context admin. Now I'm in the admin context. If I do a show run, it shows me the individual items for that context. Now, in the newer versions, it does do some conversion and pull things over. In some of the earlier versions, the 7.0 versions, it would wipe your config. So newer versions do have some things get pulled through. So my existing access list, object groups, items got pulled over into the admin context. So in this case, I have a second group that I'm adding in, and I'm going to add in my other context here and rearrange things a little bit. Pulling back to my other example here, We are going to actually leave this as it is where the admin is, but we're just going to add in the second context here for where switch 2 is. Again, for the scope of the lab, watch carefully. If you are asked to create 2 different contexts, create those. If you're not asked to, if you're just asked to create 1 additional one, you could ask the proctor if it's okay to leave the admin as the other context. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and create the other context inside 128. We're going to switch back to our system, change to a context for a system. And from here, we're going to go ahead and set up that other context. So our context itself, we're going to name as inside 128. Creating that context, give it a config file. Again, it doesn't have that file existing, so it did go ahead and create the file. If you did happen to have a file that was named that already in your ASA's flash, it would use that, whatever information was in there for the configuration. So in some cases, I've seen people that say have a rental rack that they use, and there's an existing item that happens to be a file in flash that happens to be the same as they name it. Then when they change that context, there's everything magically pre-configured and they don't understand how. In this case, if the file does already exist and does have config information in it, it will use what's there. In this case, did not have that information, so it's going to go ahead and create the file. And syntax was slightly off there, extra slash in there, so it's switching that over. So I've got my context created. Beyond that, I would need to have my interfaces allocated. Okay, so we're going to say this particular context, just looking at the outside interface and that inside interface. So we're going to allocate that interface. Ethernet 0/0. And before we can allocate our other interface, we need to make sure it's defined. Go ahead and define that. Specify the VLAN information is a subinterface. And then switch back to our context configuration. Again, context configuration still in the system, not change to context. Change to context would go to that actual context itself. So globally here, we're going to set up the definitions first. So context inside 128. From there, we're going to allocate that other interface. And we're just going to call this inside. Whatever you'd like. Again, just showing the ability to put in an alias there. Change to context inside 128. And you don't need to type in the whole thing. It will take like a tab complete. You won't actually be able to tab it out, but if you type a partial, that's enough for it to match the context. It will take that and move you to that context. And if I look at the show run here, the interfaces that I see are Ethernet 00 and the interface inside. In this case, the interface inside is the alias that I passed through referencing that Ethernet 0/1.128. Now for the scope of the actual lab, you could be given specific inside-outside. You could be given, say, an output of something like show interface. So you could have different types of things you could be given. I could just give you the output of show interface and say, this is what it should look like with regards to names and items. In this case, if you're on a context and I see my interface of inside, then I would know that has to be something that was passed from the system configuration. In this case, I have these nice double quotes with nothing between them, which means I do not have any nameifs on my interface, which, as we discussed earlier, is going to cause problems. And it does mention available but not configured via nameif, even though we do show that the line protocol is up. In the event we did have a main interface shut down, our sub-interfaces or our interfaces passed through to the context would show as being down. We're going to go ahead and give those some information. We're just going to call those inside and outside. Ethernet 0 we're going to call outside. Set to 0 by default. Can have the same address, can have a different address. That's really up to you or up to what your lab booklet says. If it does specify, we're going to go ahead and give it the same address. Conflict there. And for inside interface, name of inside, again, inside being a special, setting it to 100 for the security level. And we're going to go ahead and specify address as well. We've got a nameif, we've got an address. In this case, the interfaces are not showing a shutdown, so we don't have to worry about a no-shut within our context. Run some basic connectivity here. Try and ping. In this case, pinging our switch. So our switch here, switch 2, happens to have the address of the .8, so verifying we can ping that address. Now if we switch to our other context, try and do that same ping. Again, unsuccessful because this particular context doesn't have a route for that network. Now looking at route information, again, we don't have information shared between the two. He just shows the connected networks that he has. Looking at our other context, he also just has his own connected networks. So in this case, again, because you do not have the other networks there, you do not have the connectivity for those. He's not able to pass traffic for those other networks. As mentioned earlier, would need to add in things like static routes. In this case, I could add in a static route under this context for router 5. On the inside interface. And able to successfully ping router 5. Again, a variety of different items. look at your context configuration carefully. What am I being asked to do? How am I being asked to do it? Be familiar with some of your various restrictions, things you can and can't do. Your restriction on interface sharing. You need to have some sort of distinction being able to pass traffic between those. Restrictions on feature availability. Things that are not allowed, say the VPNs, routing protocols, things like that, not allowed in the multiple context mode. Different restrictions on what's allowed, what's not allowed there. Now in this case, we did take off our failover commands and our failover items. For the most part, you can still do failover with context. It's really just slight add-ons at that point. We did talk about the ability of looking at those individual items. So I mentioned again, make sure you're familiar with various items that you have, things you have available there. Again, looking through the failover configuration, and some of the miscellaneous items you can do, getting into things like the failover groups. So pulling back our sample configuration here, looking at the options for context, in this case, within your context itself, having that failover information specified. So now on our device itself, we had failover configured and we took it off. We're going to go ahead and change back to our system. We change to our system, and if we try just typing in failover, turn it back on, we get an error message, mate's operating mode not compatible with my mode. So mate is showing as single, this device showing as multiple. We're going to switch back to router ASA2. And ASA2 says he's currently in standby state. We're going to go ahead and change ASA2 to a mode multiple. And let ASA2 reload. And turn failover back on here. Give ASA2 a minute to reload here. In the meantime, we did mention the ability to do things like failover groups. We're going to go ahead and look at those real quick. Again, if you try and configure failover group when you have failover enabled, you will get an error message. We're going to go ahead and disable failover temporarily. Again, just the no failover command, leaving the other configuration in there. Configuration will stay in there with the no failover command. We're just taking the failover and just turning it off momentarily, but keeping all our failover config in there. Okay, failover group 1. And say we're primary for group 1. Say failover group 2. And say we're secondary for group 2. Now, with the failover groups themselves, by default, all items are going to be into failover group 1. We want to change particular context, but change that context in the system mode here. So context inside take the way I want it to. Context side 128. And join that other failover group. Manually specify other one for admin as well. And we have our failover group specified. Go ahead and turn failover back on. Did get a slight error there when it thought we were trying to create additional contexts. You do have a limit with your contexts themselves as far as your version, number of contexts allowed. So going through show version, showing that by default, will this particular license have 2 security contexts. In this case, that's 2 security contexts plus the admin context. So different numbers allowed. In this case, 2 by default with this particular licensing that he has. Pull up our configuration here on this guy. Bring on failover. Detected the output mate, taking his replication from the mate. And again, because of some of the features not being allowed multiple contexts, if there are other things in your configuration, in this case things like IPsec, it may not like that when he's trying to pull those in. Those particular items are just going to be ignored. Look at our show failover now. We have our information here. Device is showing as active and having traffic passing for those devices as well. Back to ASA1. Showing as active here. Going to go ahead and reload ASA1, make sure that things fail over smoothly. We are getting prompted for our individual contexts. You can also do a save on the device themselves. Right mem or right mem all to save all your contexts at once. And he's doing his graceful shutdown. We're going to switch to ASA2, verifying that he shows his information here. In this case, ASA2 is showing as he is now active there. Verify that we can ping those guys. To context 128, verify we can ping the switch. Our connections here. Slight misconfiguration here on our second port here. Mode on our second ASA, ASA2 here, showing as dynamic desirable. In this case, with the ASA is not going to negotiate a trunk. We do have that set to a switch port mode of trunk. Back to ASA2. That's set to mode of trunk. We're getting our interfaces showing as up. We're not receiving traffic, we're sending traffic though. Active there. Switch back to ASA2. Integration here. And we have success there. Just had video cut out on me. Did you guys get video okay there? Little blip there. All right, any other miscellaneous questions on the contact setup? Again, for the most part, be familiar with items. Configuration examples are available in the documentation there. We're going to go ahead and switch over and take a look at transparent firewall next.